Good evening. Very warm welcome to this global energy debate organized by Shell and hosted by the Baker Institute and the Rice University. Thank you very much for participating. My name is Dick Benschop. I'm responsible in Shell for both the Netherlands and for global gas market development. This is the first of this kind of debates. We had the essay writing, the selection of the essay. We have 5 nominees for tonight, and we have a jury, including yourselves. So we're going to learn a bit tonight as well, how best to do this, because we will be doing this across the world, not just in the United States, but also in Europe, in the Middle East and in Asia. And have you, students, future leaders, participating in those global energy debates. And we do that for 2 reasons, I guess. The first one is that the world faces quite a few challenges in the next decades with regard to energy and how to provide for energy and how to deal with it. And we need innovation and we need ideas for that. And that's why we look at the young generation. And the second reason is that we're not always confident that the best policies and the best policy measures are in place or will be in place, and that we need a discussion and debate to get there. And from what I've read already from the essays, and I'm sure you will experience the same with our panelists tonight, is that I was quite impressed with what you put on the table to that extent. And I would not mind the 5 of you formulating energy policy to come. I very much would like to thank our judges, Amy Myers-Jeffy, Ken Matlock, Val Marmillan, tonight to participate here and also to host us. When I left The Hague and I said I'm going to Houston, to Rice University, Baker Institute, of course, colleague asked me, and I don't think Ken and Val will mind me telling this, are you going to see Amy? And I said, I'm on a panel with Amy. So you're lucky. So thank you very much for participating and helping us here. Perhaps a few words on what I said, the energy challenge the world faces and how we look at that in Shell through our scenarios and the thinking we develop. I think we could best describe it as a triple challenge for the world as far as energy is concerned. The first challenge is the enormous rise in demand for energy, which cannot be underestimated. It's driven by the growth in population. Of course, here in the United States, population is still growing, but not at a very large pace. In Europe, population is not growing anymore. But in large parts of the world, of course, there's a huge population growth in China, in India, in Africa, in Latin America. The world is now, I believe, on its way to the 7th billion inhabitants. And the expectation is that 2 more billion people will be added between now and 2050. Somebody calculated that back and said that means that between now and 2050, a city of 1 million people will be added every week. And that has to be provided for. And those new inhabitants, as well as the existing ones in the relatively poor countries, developing very fast, emerging economies, are going through their most energy-intensive phase of their economic growth. And that's the second factor which will drive the enormous increase in demand for energy. And that growth, that economic growth is quite basic. You're talking about people who are coming out of a situation of poverty or energy poverty, moving into, in their country, middle class type of conditions. So the first motorcycle or the first car, the first refrigerator, first heating, you name it. And that's a kind of demand for energy, which cannot be denied either. We cannot just say, sorry, there's no more energy, or we can't develop it, or it's too expensive, or because of climate change, we should not consume more. This is one of the greatest achievements of our time, that we see hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty and becoming middle class. And there's 2.5 billion people who want to go through that same route, have that same aspiration in the coming decades. And they do that in countries who will then go through their most energy-intensive phase of economic growth. Just to underline what the demand for energy is and what the dimension of it is. It's, for me, that's also a human dimension, or even a moral dimension of the demand for energy. Second challenge is, of course, for supply then to keep up with demand. And that will not be easy. Given the pace of demand growth, a lot of the easy supplies already developed, new supplies being more difficult and more costly. And thirdly, of course, the external effects of the growth in energy demand and supply. For example, climate change, but also other aspects of energy consumption. So how to deal with that at the same time. There's various ways of putting it. The world will need double the amount of energy and at the same time half the CO2 emissions. So a factor 4 difference between what we have today. Another way of putting it, as we've done in Shell, is that if you take demand, if it would grow along historical efficiency indicators, demand would treble between now and 2050 for energy. If we do an heroic effort on energy, we might limit the growth in demand to doubling the amount of energy we consume today. Supply, if we keep continuing the way we increase the supply of energy, the gap that will exist in 2050 between the demand and the supply is about as big as total energy consumption in the year 2000. So that's the energy challenge in one picture. And one of our more poetic people in Shell has dubbed that a zone of extraordinary misery or extraordinary opportunity. And that's where I think the energy debate comes in. How are we going to create the conditions for the policies, for the innovation, so that this will be a zone of extraordinary opportunity and not a zone of extraordinary misery for the world. In Shell we have translated that into we need more energy, we need cleaner energy, we need smarter mobility. And one of the things we find very exciting, but I won't dwell too long upon it tonight, is of course the emergence of natural gas as a fast growing source of energy supply. You don't often in energy, which is a big system, which does not move very fast, come across such a game changer as gas has been. We always knew that unconventional gas, shale gas, tight gas existed. We had never thought it would become available at economic conditions so fast and in such vast quantities. And it's not just the United States, it's South America, it's South Africa, it's North Africa, it's Australia, it's China, it's Russia, it's in Eastern Europe, it's in many more places in the world. And that's one of those changes that creates options to think through. And we believe that although the world is getting used to the idea that a revolution is taking place there, that we have perhaps we have only half realized the options that it gives and how to make use of it. So very interested to hear from the young leaders, the new generation, how are we going to solve those dilemmas. I'm very excited that you want to spend time with us and that you want to give us your ideas. Thank you very much once again to the Baker Institute. Thank you for participating. And now I hand over to Miles.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by introducing our moderator. Our moderator is an award-winning journalist with more than a decade of experience covering a range of business topics. For the last 5 years, he's been an energy reporter at the Houston Chronicle, where he's covered everything from oil refining to the latest developments in the real shale gas boom, and filed stories from oil fields in West Texas, offshore platforms in Brazil, ethanol plants in Iowa, and drilling rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. Last year, he played a key role in the coverage of the BP's role in the major oil spill off the coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as providing guest analysis on the crisis for CNN, NPR, and BBC. Before the Chronicle, he covered the automotive industry for the Detroit News, and prior to that, he worked for newspapers in Montgomery, Alabama, New Orleans, Louisiana, and he's a native of Waco, Texas. He holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Texas and a master's in education from the University of Mississippi. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and distinct privilege to introduce Mr. Brett Clanton. Thank you. Clanton is coming up. I'd like to note, so all of you have a copy of your program right here. If you open up your program, you'll find this. It's a little ticket. This is your stub. If you stay after this debate, you'll find out if you won one of these, which is courtesy of Shell. We have 2 gift cards for gas. It's a $100 value, so please stay afterwards. Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Klein. Excellent.
That's pretty clever, man. Great. Thanks for that nice introduction there, Miles. And I always tell people that I could spend my whole life writing about energy and barely scratch the surface. It's just such a huge and dynamic and complex topic and really fascinating. And it's a great time to be thinking about energy and writing about energy and thinking about what's going to come next. So I'm honored to introduce our panelists here, our students first, and then our distinguished judges. And then I'm going to give a few ground rules about how the presentation is going to work. And then we're just going to jump right in. So let me begin with an introduction of our students here. I'm going to begin here at this end with Andrew Amos, here sitting closest to me. Second, we have Apoorv Bhargava. We have next to him is Elise Landry. Next to her, we have Josh Ruttenberg. And then at the end, Raj Salhotra. So these are our five student panelists who've all written essays to get to this point, and so they are going to be up here, and we'll talk about a little bit about the ground rules and how they're going to defend what they've written here in just a minute. But before we do that, judges here sitting in front of the students. We have 4 distinguished panelists. The first is Amy Myers Jaffe, who is the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow in Energy Studies and Director of the Baker Institute's Energy Forum and Associate Director of the Rice Energy Program. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with her. Also, we have Dr. Ken Medlock, who is the James A. Baker and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics at the Baker Institute, an adjunct professor in the Rice University Department of Economics. You just heard from Dick Benschop, who is President Director of Shell, the Netherlands, and Vice President of Gas and Market Development. And then finally, we have Val Marmillion, who is President and Co-founder of MCCO and Managing Director of America's Wetland Foundation. So with that, let me give you a couple of thoughts about how this is going to go, and then we're going to proceed with the presentation. So So we're going to begin with a couple of with brief statements from each of the students, a 2-minute statement from each on what they wrote about in their essays. So we have you'll notice students here, we have Whitney with the time card who is going to hold you to that 2 minutes. So make sure that you stick into it. So think of the presidential debates, kind of an opening statement here, where you can defend what you've written. After that, we're going to open it up to the panelists. Each panelist will ask a question of each of the students individually, and they've been assigned one of you to ask a question. And then after that, I will follow up with a question chosen at random to one of the students. That's kind of a follow-up, a response, rebuttal in that same vein. And then our third phase, our third round, if you will be to turn to the audience. You'll notice on your tables there that you have little cards, question cards, that as we go along here, you can think about what the panelists are saying and the topics that we're covering. And I encourage you to fill out, ask a question that you would like one of the students to answer. And we're going to compile those as the program is going, and we're going to collect those and ask a few of those here in our third phase as time allows. And then finally, at the end, we're gonna kind of have an American Idol piece of this here, where everyone in the audience will vote on who they think actually won the debate here. So you'll have a little ballot card there, and we'll collect those, and then the judges will convene. They'll choose a winner, and then we'll come back and announce that. So. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the students, and Andrew has the luck of beginning here, just by virtue of his name. So, take it away, Andrew.
What I want to begin with is that this is a deep problem. The good news is I've done some light reading, and the 3,000 pages right over there in that corner, I can't present in 2 minutes, but I'm going to try to give you a good summary of what all that says and what the best experts in the world say. So here's my vision. 2030, we have 20% green carbon oil, 55% natural gas, and 25% alternative energies. 2050, we have 5% oil, 45% natural gas, and 50% alternative energies. So here's the plan of how to do that. This is how you weigh the round. First, we're going to have green carbon oil and enhanced oil recovery. This is going to include carbon capture, which is going to send CO2 to the market as positive economic value. Basically, oil is not going away for several decades. Actually, Brazil is building nuclear submarines right now to protect its wells for Petrobras. So what we see is not going away anytime soon. So what we have to do is make it clean while we still have it. Second argument here is we want coal to natural gas switching. According to a Nobel laureate, Robert Kurl, and his Baker Institute paper here, what we can do is use a minimal carbon tax to completely switch coal into natural gas for electricity markets. And so what we can see here is that we can also use this as reinvesting in new developments. We can use that revenue to reinvest in clean energy. And the third part of this is we're going to transition from fossil fuels to alternative energies. What we need here is increased research and development. Actually, the United States energy R&D has fallen from 10% in 1980 to 2% of total R&D in 2005. The total United States solar R&D is $200 million, while Petrobras is spending $200 billion just for salt bed exploration right now. So what we see is we need the new Apollo mission. We need the next Manhattan Project. We need to develop solar and hydrogen and switch these numbers around to move the R&D to alternative energies. So we're already moving towards these things, so this plan works. Second, we're addressing electricity and the transport fuel markets. And third, this is a three-pronged approach. We're improving existing sources, developing energy distribution systems, and developing emerging technologies through research and development. Everything equal, the energy source with the lowest cost will always be sought. And while the government can use $10 million to feed 6,000 people per year, science can use $10 million to help 1 billion people feed themselves. So at the end of the day, no policy can save us. The technology must win, or we all lose.
Thank you, Andrew. Now let's move next to Purav.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are today at a crossroads. Unfortunately, I will be repeating a little bit of what Mr. Benshoff has said, but it is true. The severity of the problem is such. Supply and demand form our crossroads, and looming over them is the problem of greenhouse gases. Should we sit back and do nothing? That is the approach it seems that many governments and many policymakers are tending to make. My approach has 3 phases. I believe we start phase 1 today. The first and foremost thing we need to attempt to do is to improve our energy efficiency, whether it be automobiles, factories, power plants, anything. Energy efficiency is the first step. As Andrew said, oil is not going anywhere. In fact, our entire infrastructure depends on oil and gas today. For that reason, in my phase 1, which starts today, I believe that efficiency and a transition towards natural gas is the most critical element of our future. Natural gas is available in many different sources, whether it be shale gas, hydrates, or just normal gas fields. We can look at Qatar, for example. It has abundant natural gas. Starting this year as well, or 2012 as you see fit, we need to implement phase 2. Phase 2 includes a high amount of research and development, which includes research and development in renewable technologies, including solar, wind, and wave. However, at the same time, we need to start researching and developing biofuels and other transportation fuels that could take over from oil. Carbon capture and storage also needs to be looked at very seriously. And finally, phase 3. Phase 3 would be implemented in approximately 2030. By 2030, we should hope to have achieved renewable technologies. And also, by 2050, we should be looking at trying to implement an electric car system and moving away from an oil and gas-based economy. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my belief that if we follow my 3-phased approach, we will reach a sustainable and an equitable world in the next 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Apoorv. Let's turn next to Elise Landry.
In 2030 and 2050, not only will the demand for energy increase, but as population increases, the demand for food will increase. My argument is to use the waste generated from agriculture to create energy. Cellulosic biomass can be converted both into ethanol and butanol through simple treatments such as pyrolysis and enzymatic reactors. This will not only be a carbon neutral system, but it will help create the energy to help fill the gap between the supply and the demand. But as they've mentioned, this can't fill the gap by itself. Oil is still going to be a prevalent source due to all the infrastructure that already exists. As gas technology increases, such as shale gas and horizontal drilling, gas is a cleaner burning fuel, and we need to switch off of coal and onto this gas fuel in the future. But I believe in the future, as we look at the CO2 emissions, that energy is going to be the driving factor. We're going to try to support all the 1 million population cities that are growing up every week with energy. And through that, we might need to turn to nuclear. I wish I could say that technology will lead the way and will have enough advancements to create enough energy. But in all honesty, in 20 years, I think since we have nuclear power and we know how this technology works and we have abundant sources of uranium, if we build international repositories and start building nuclear plants now, we can fuel the energy demand of the future. And as I mentioned, as coal is a very dirty burning fuel, and so we need to make sure to switch off of that and turn to other sources. So my primary points are to use the waste generated by agriculture and create cellulosic biofuels. We need to continue to research into our gas and create cleaner burning fuels. If necessary, we need to move to nuclear, and we need to reduce the coal consumption as much as possible.
Thanks very much, Elise. And now let's turn to Josh Ruttenberg.
We need a plan that can be both technologically and politically feasible to transition into the next century. We need to focus in 3 steps. The first, hydrocarbons. The second, renewables. And the third, energy efficiency. The first part of this plan involves transitioning towards more natural gas. Natural gas can be used both in generation to replace existing coal plants, as well as a liquid fuel in order to replace and provide a stopgap measure between current oil, which as my co-speakers have said, we are currently dependent on, and transition us into cleaner fuels. And part of this is through the new shale gas technologies that are being widely accepted both politically and are proving themselves technologically. And we can, I believe, by 2030 find more environmentally friendly ways of producing shale gas. Now, in terms of nuclear energy, I think that that's a fairly politically stagnant energy source for the time being. So that provides roughly 8 to 10% of our energy, and I don't think that that will be changing anytime soon. Additionally, biomass and biofuels tend to rely on water consumption, which is already another global problem. And therefore, I envision a future energy portfolio that does not focus on biomass. As such, for renewable energy, additionally, hydropower is at 20% globally, and that has been mostly tapped as that is a historically easily accessible resource. Therefore, I see the future of renewable energies as being primarily focused within wind energy and solar power. Through wind energy, there are many opportunities for connecting back to the grid across large, vast areas, both in the United States and in other countries. In solar, while most people are familiar with photovoltaics, there's great opportunities for other solar concentrated heat sources for power. There's also power towers, which are a very interesting concept that could also have implementation within large desert areas and other rural areas. Lastly, I'd like to talk about efficiency, which is the final part of the plan. We can attempt to meet the energy needs through increasing various sources, but we also have to take into account the importance of efficiency by increasing standards of electronics, cars, and other areas, because as McKinsey and Company actually point out in one of their reports, we can have a negative energy consumption effect by improving efficiency that would outweigh most of the improvements through renewables alone.
Thanks very much, Josh. And now to our final student is Raj Sahotra, please.
We all know that in 2050, the energy demand is going to double. So we need to figure out how we're going to get there. One option, of course, is to stay with the status quo, which is relying heavily on coal and oil. But because of economic reasons, environmental and geopolitical reasons, that's basically just not feasible. So what are we going to do to sort of get past that and, create a sustainable energy future? So I think you want to split this up into sort of two branches, one being the transportation sector and one being the electricity sector. There's crossover, of course, with electric vehicles, but we'll get to that in a second. With regard to the electricity sector, we have to obviously reduce the reliance on coal, and the only way that's going to happen is if the market internalizes the externality. That is to say, there becomes some price on carbon. I mean, according to a recent study, coal pollution costs $50 billion a year, and that has to be internalized by the market. The second thing is we know natural gas is going to play a significant role. The key thing is placing some environmental regulations on fracking. I mean, we don't want to stifle fracking by, having too many regulations, but we cannot just let fracking go unchecked. Third thing, obviously, with regard to nuclear, we don't want to have this knee-jerk reaction like was seen in Germany where they're saying basically they're not going to have any more nuclear. And finally, renewable energy has to play a key part, solar and wind. Wind right now is close to being competitive. In Texas, you can get wind power at about 11.1 cents a kilowatt hour, or natural gas and coal is about 9.8. So it's very, very close. And if the market internalizes the externality, then that could become in play. And finally, we have to increase energy efficiency, as everyone's been saying. But one thing that they've missed is building retrofits. That is to say, making buildings and homes more energy efficient. Finally, in the transportation sector, we have to wean off of petroleum and move more into both electric vehicles, compressed natural gas, and increasing the penetration of hybrid vehicles. Finally, there's one thing that we've taken into account is there are millions of people around the world who are not connected to the electricity grid around the world. And you need to have two steps with regard to those people. One, connecting them to the grid. And the second thing is promoting distributed generation from independent power sources like wind and solar. Thank you.
Very interesting thoughts from each of them. Why don't we just interrupt here with a quick round of applause for each of our students. Heard a lot of great ideas here, and we're going to probe a little bit further, and we're going to turn to our judges here for phase 2. So I'm going to begin with, at this end of the table, with Dick Bishop, excuse me, and he's going to ask a question. I'm going to follow with a question to one of you, or you may hear from another panelist if they want to follow up. Okay, so we have 6 minutes apiece for each one of these questions here. So you can keep your eye on Whitney over there too, who's still keeping the time. So go ahead, Dick. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Great presentations indeed. I would like to ask a question to Elise. You talked about agriculture, waste, and biofuels, but you also talked about nuclear, and that stood out, of course. What are your thoughts about one of the big issues for nuclear, of course, is nuclear waste, and the US has a history in terms of wanting to deal with nuclear waste, but not getting to its resolution. Other countries have faced the same. How do you look at that issue as far as the potential of nuclear energy is concerned?
In terms of nuclear waste, the U.S. started to build a repository in Yucca Mountain, and it was actually shut down by the Obama administration. But I think that nuclear power is something that the technology already exists, and it produces a lot of energy. And I think the international world is going to notice that. And because of that, I think that a repository will be built for this waste. There's also different methods of dealing with the waste. You can put it into, instead of having a repository, you can treat it in different ways. So you can actually reduce its mass or store it in different areas so you don't have to build a repository. But my main thought is to have an international collaboration for one.
Let me follow up here with Andrew. You talk a little bit about nuclear as part of your global energy mix going to 2030, correct?
Just a very small part, mostly only existing infrastructure. There's really no emphasis on building much more new nuclear. There's a lot of problems with nuclear. First, there's way too much capital. It takes 10 years to build a nuclear plant. The next generation tech is not ready, so there's no reason to invest in the ones that the current ones right now that don't have the technology. There's also obvious security reasons, such as nuclear proliferation. And finally, obviously, storing the waste is a huge problem. We don't know the hazards of this, and for all we know, it could be worse than oil.
So let me turn to another panelist here to ask a question of another student. Let's move to Amy Myers-Jaffe, please.
So I have a question for Aparev. You talk in your essay about the transition from natural gas to renewables over time, and so the eventual evolution to an electric car system. Could you give us some more details about what kind of policies or environment you think is going to produce that transition and how you see that taking place?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, we currently have the technology to produce hybrid vehicles. So we can already produce vehicles which run partly on electric power. Now, the remaining part of that car obviously runs on fossil fuels. Currently, it is, at least in the United States and for the majority of the remaining world, cars run on oil, petroleum. Whereas we have seen it successfully being implemented in other countries that cars have started running on natural gas. In fact, Henry Ford at one point debated whether he should use gas or oil because both of them were prevalent and both of them could have been used. I think the governments across the world need to start making a push towards natural gas being used as the fuel, whether it be CNG, LPG, or other forms that we may not even know about currently, and pushing towards cars using those, while at the same time leaving them as flex hybrid vehicles. The further we move along, the more government, and in fact, more importantly, industry, should push towards cars and other vehicles becoming electric, purely electric, so moving towards models such as the Nissan Leaf. things like that. So I believe that over the next 30 years, as battery technology improves, and that's a very important thing, we really need to make a lot of investments in battery technology and improving that. As battery technology improves and as charging capabilities improve, we can move from a flex fuel car, which runs on both hydrocarbons and electric power, to a purely electric powered vehicle.
So Raj, how do you tackle this problem, though? Many people see the electric vehicle as sort of the holy grail of transportation, but the trade-off, of course, is that we have to produce a lot more electricity in order to power all of our cars, which obviously we need some feedstock to produce that electricity. So how do you manage that? I mean, are electric vehicles the transportation mode of the future?
So the first thing I would say is that it takes a lot of electricity to turn oil into gasoline, right? And I was just reading a recent paper, right, that said basically, according to the Argonne National Lab, it takes about 6 kilowatt hours to refine 1 gallon of gas. And then if you include the sort of extraction and shipping costs, that'll come to about 8 kilowatt hours per gallon of gas, right? And if you use about an average vehicle, let's say of 27 miles per gallon, then to go 100 miles, right, you need 30 kilowatt hours from a car that runs on gas, and you also need 30 kilowatt hours from an electric vehicle. So first of all, I mean, the electricity trade-off is similar. But I mean, the second thing is, we certainly will need electricity. I mean, we'll need to, increase power generation, and that's going to come from increasing reliance on natural gas, increasing renewable energy, as I said, and then maintaining nuclear and trying to avoid these like knee-jerk reactions like we saw in Germany. And then same thing, fracking, France banning fracking. Again, this is like a knee-jerk reaction to like some environmental concerns. Yes, we need regulations, but there's no need to, go to all the way to the other extreme.
Got it. Thanks a lot. Let's move now to Dr. Ken Medlock. Let's see who has a question for.
Well, first of all, I'd like to reiterate a comment that Dick made. You guys all did a very good job in making your 2-minute presentations. A lot of information to cram into a few words. But my question really, and I'm going to direct it to Andrew first, but through the course of the deliberations, if the rest of you could try to address this question, I think it would be very useful. Is you're really talking about a transition that requires a tremendous amount of capital stock turnover. And some of that capital that's actually in place has not outlived its current useful life. So how do you propose to, A, cover the stranded costs of retiring capital before its useful life is actually met? And B, how do you actually pay for a policy that would propose to do such a thing?
Yeah, sure. So that's a big disadvantage. But at the same, if you look at the surface of it, but if you look deeper, for example, I propose a carbon tax. So what we can do from that is use the revenues from that, and that's how we can pay for R&D in a very large portion. As far as existing capital, we understand that we will have to lose some capital, that there is a lot of capital there. But the ultimate aim is that we can move towards new technologies that use that capital better. So we're actually creating a more efficient market that uses that capital in a better way through these new technologies. And so I don't claim to have a perfect plan. But at the end of the day, I believe that my plan is the best because the advantages outweigh the disadvantages to the greatest degree. And while it's not perfect, I think we're saving a lot of things. There's many benefits to my plan. And there's definitely ways to pay for it. So I think as far as specificity goes, I think I've provided the most specific plan of anyone. And so I think I've provided a pretty good framework for moving towards a new capital. And so, for example, Petrobras is spending $200 billion right now just on seabed exploration. And we understand that that's just not going to go away, as I said in my opening argument. We actually want to harness that and hopefully invest in R&D and new technologies. So while we understand that's there, we can use a carbon tax and move towards a better plan without destroying the existing markets. And I think that my plan does that fairly well.
Josh, let me turn to you. Same question. How are you going to pay for it?
All right. Well, First of all, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the existing technology that's out there. I think that's one of the parts of my plan that's so appealing, is you can take advantage of wind energy, which because of the government subsidies that have been fed into it, is now actually proving itself on the markets. And there's a lot of areas in the Midwestern United States, as well as I'm sure other areas of the world, where there aren't communities that are served. There aren't communities that are connected to the grid. And I think that's where you can fill a lot of the energy gap. And then as we progress to 2030 and 2050, start to phase out some of those coal-fired power plants that are powering the electric vehicles with wind energy and solar energy. And as far as funding it, I mean, the government subsidies have worked to some degree with wind and solar powers. I think natural gas is also, you're talking about a very versatile fuel source, something that can be used both in transportation as well as the commercial sector. And it's already got the infrastructure there. So I think focusing a lot of that attention back on natural gas for the hydrocarbons in the current infrastructure also helps to alleviate some of the need for replacing existing, bringing up new capital and replacing existing projects.
So not only are we talking about capital needed, but there's also a lot of political will to do some of these things you're talking about, wholesale shifts in our energy infrastructure. And I think, Raj, you touched on the idea of a carbon tax, which has been a hot potato, to say the least. How does Congress have the political will to approve a carbon tax?
Okay, so it's not going to get passed before 2012. I mean, we can already count that. That's not going to happen at all. Post this, I think if U.S. policymakers can just step back a second and try to understand the real costs that are associated with pollution, I think it's conceivable that some sort of price on carbon, whether it's a cap and trade, and we need to not forget there are regional, first of all, cap and trade programs, and B, there are renewable portfolio standards within a state, which can do a similar type thing, which essentially says states will mandate that, for example, 20% of their electricity has to come from a renewable source. But will a carbon tax happen in the next 2 years? No. Is it feasible down the line? I think so, but I could be overly optimistic at our policymakers in Washington.
Fair enough. Let's turn to our final judge, Val Marmillion. Val is here. Who do you have a question for?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Raj a question and ask you to open your mind up a little bit to this possibility. A couple of your colleagues talked about carbon as a positive opportunity, and we've had a run at carbon in this country and with cap and trade, and it was not very successful. We have a consumer democracy, and we have reports from the industry that we're going to be under demand either by consumers or by growing states, nation states, for more and more carbon-based products. So is there anywhere in your thinking an opportunity for the beneficial use of carbon so that, as we know, markets don't respond well over the long time to penalties? Is there a way that this product surfaces as a usable product, a common carrier product, ways in which we can utilize carbon in a beneficial way and create a viable market out of it?
Look, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not exactly sure of the science. Let me be perfectly clear. I'm the only non-engineer up here. But what I do want to say is, carbon capture and sequestration seems to, make sense, one. But at the end of the day, to me, it doesn't seem like without trying to get the market to at least internalize the pollution aspect, to me, it doesn't seem. Basically, without the market internalizing the cost of pollution, to me, it doesn't seem like there is a way for us to really transition from coal to other fossil fuels. And it's not like I'm saying, we need to have a concerted policy that says, okay, 25% of our energy has to come from natural gas, because I don't think, the government can be here to decide how much, percentage of, each source we get our electricity from. I mean, the only thing we want to do is, get the government to create the incentives and to create the efficient market which will then determine, what fuel sources we use.
But there's an unequal balance going on. I mean, if we need to extend our use of carbon-based products, and there's consumer demand, which equals political will, usually, because people want what they want. How can the equation with just carbon taxes or buying carbon credits going to get us there? I mean, we have to get there, so we have to do something with this carbon, and I would be interested if the panel has any other ideas, or if you have any ideas on what to do with it.
Maybe we give someone else another chance to speak up there. Go ahead, Elise.
I'll jump in. I guess one thing I've thought about is currently a lot of reservoirs, in order to enhance the oil recovery, a lot of CO2 is sometimes re-injected into the wells. And one thought that I had is, as these wells become economically exhausted, you could re-inject some of the carbon dioxide in there to kind of like minimize the impact. And that was something I was kind of thinking about, is just having a continual cycle of re-injecting in the oil industry. Outside of the oil industry, I think it's going to be necessary to turn to carbon neutral type sources. As I mentioned earlier, the cellulosic biomass is actually a carbon neutral source, because if the agricultural waste was just left there to decay, it would produce emissions. And so by using that energy source to create energy, you're not adding any more carbon to the atmosphere. And so I think that, yes, we should look into how to use that carbon, but at the same time, we should look in how to minimize that carbon.
Andrew wanted to weigh in with a thought here, too.
Yeah, just real quickly. As Elise suggested, for deep carbon sequestration, I would say that's completely undesirable because it creates expensive waste, and also there's long-term storage hazards, which we have no idea what they're going to do. You're basically sticking something in the ground and hoping it turns out well. As far as your specific question goes, the positive economic value of CO2, we can actually re-inject it into the market. If you look at the Green Carbon Center here at Rice, some of the things that Dr. James Tour has suggested is that we can replace hydrofluorocarbons, which have 1,000 times the global warming potential as CO2. We can have feedstock for industries like food and canned soda and things like that. And lastly, we can replace water in enhanced oil recovery. So there's definitely good uses how we can re-inject the CO2 into the market.
I wanted to ask Apurav sort of a slightly different version of this question. We've been talking about political will to make some of these changes that you're talking about, but you're also talking dealing with very powerful interests, coal industry being a very large one. You talk in your paper, in your essay, that you'd like old inefficient coal-fired power plants to be replaced with natural gas plants. Who is going to persuade the coal industry to stand by and let that happen?
Absolutely, and this is something that, of course, is going to be a very difficult transition. I mean, at the end of the day, we're looking at outdated technology, or at least engineering-wise, we're looking at outdated technology moving forward in the future. Looking at coal, there are options available. Coal to liquids, coal to gas, these are technologies that have been suggested in the past. For example, syngas is an option. Now, that does not mean that we need to continue with coal. These areas can find alternate modes of economic development. For example, in the same Pennsylvania, Virginia, Appalachian region, we're also starting to find larger areas of natural gas and oil available underneath the ground, as what nowadays we frack. We use the fracking and horizontal drilling methods to extract that. And obviously, we're looking at a problem of structural demand, structural unemployment occurring, obviously, if we phase out coal. So what we need to do is use the same skill sets that are available with the workers, with the industries available in these regions, and try and move them to areas such as natural gas, such as oil. Now, the one thing that I think Dr. Medlock asked about was, how do we pay for it? That's a really good point, and I actually support the carbon tax method as well. But I think it's harsh to say to a person who's been driving his car and hasn't necessarily gone about driving an SUV for the past 20 years. It's harsh to say to them, well, you've been driving it, we haven't given you an alternate method, so we're just going to start taxing you for no reason. That's very harsh on the consumer, and you're absolutely right, the consumer makes the decisions. It's never going to be popular. So what we need to do is actually start introducing alternate fuels to the consumer as well. Natural gas was one, but also biofuels. And biofuels, not the same kind of corn ethanol type biofuel that we have been traditionally producing in America, but looking at things such as algae fuel, looking at cellulosic biofuels, and investing in these technologies. Not subsidizing companies, but actually investing in their research and development. Once you offer mixed fuels such as these, or you offer them in their pure form to the consumer, and then you tax pure gasoline, you've at least offered the consumer an option. If they wish to continue using gasoline and paying the higher price, that is their option. But you have provided an alternate.
Thanks very much. Let me turn it back to the judges. We've been through all the judges, but I wanted to just open it up for a question from whoever wants to jump in for one of the panelists.
So I'd like to ask Andrew, going back to this question of how to use carbon positively, there's been some experimentation using carbon fibers to make wires or be a material for making cars. How does your generation see the conversion of waste into something useful as a priority, or is the priority to switch to a non-carbon source? What do you see as the more practical solution?
Yeah, well, I don't see anyone being against either one of those options. I think reusing old carbon or CO2, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not polluting. Or moving towards new sources, that's not polluting either. So what's important to notice here is that there's methods for CO2 sequestration or positive economic models. And then there's also single-walled carbon nanotubes, which we can use in the quantum grid proposed by Nobel laureate Richard Smalley right here from Rice. So we can actually use these carbon nanotubes to create electrical grids that are many times that have many times the conductivity than the existing grids. So if we're going to convert everything to these alternative energies, to solar, to wind, to whatever it may be, we're going to have to control the electricity market because this electricity has to get somewhere. So what we want to do is move from just moving masses of liquid gases and oils around to moving electrons around through wires. And that's really the future.
I'm curious as to how you feel that the debate about energy has become so polarized and politicized and in the partisan vein. How are we going to get past that to build political will cooperatively to do some of the things that you're talking about?
Elect a new Congress?
I think there really are areas for bipartisanship. I mean, certainly everyone wants to see economic growth and investment. I think it's just a matter of figuring out how we get there. And I think that, there will have to be some compromise on ideas and some areas for change. But, I think that, again, natural gas, wind, these are things that a lot of people tend to see across the board as being effective and starting to gain a lot of popularity on both sides. And so I think that, with a little bit of compromise on each side, we can achieve an energy security.
So I'd like to ask members of the panel, because everybody's, very in fashion to say that you're in favor of wind and solar, how do you all see the solution to the intermittency problem? It's not sunny 24 hours a day, wind blows at night. How do you see integrating renewables as a major portion of the energy mix under conditions that they're not available 24 hours a day?
One of the things I emphasized earlier was battery technology. Today we lie at a state where battery technology is poor. It is actually not efficient at all. We can store we store maybe 20 to 30% of what we actually what we want to do. So over the next 40, 50 years, we really need to improve our battery technology. I know for a fact that we've already been working at Rice, for example, to improve lithium-ion batteries, which are part of hybrid cars, that are part of a lot of batteries that we use today. I think if we have the ability to store energy, the intermittency problem will decrease. At the same time, I think efficiencies of these renewable technologies will improve over the next few years. And then there are, of course, quantum leaps, such as space-based solar. It's a technology that's been, it's been in the works with the Department of Defense since the 1970s. Who knows? We might have something like that coming up in the next 40, 50 years.
Yeah, I completely agree with Apoorv. I just wanted to take one sec to return to your question from before. I think there are really like a few areas where like bipartisanship is really possible. So let me give you a couple examples. One, building retrofits for energy efficiency. I mean, these are bills that have been introduced in the House of Representatives. It was the one part of the president's stimulus package that a Republican supported. So, building energy efficiency, very, very, feasible. Second thing, I think, we have to, respect what those on the right are saying about, too much regulations. I mean, yes, this is a problem. I mean, having too many regulations on fracking, that does hurt the industry. But at the same time, those on the right need to agree with those on the left that, subsidizing some of these renewable industries makes sense. And sort of the final thing that's been talked about in, so many of these bipartisan commissions is removing these tax preferences, like these subsidies to, big oil companies. And I know some of those subsidies do affect other industries as well, but there are definitely some sort of targeted tax preferences that do go, just to big oil and big coal companies, and those can be phased out.
Go ahead, Josh. You want to weigh in?
Yeah, if I could return to Dr. Jaffe's question. That's okay.
Go ahead.
About the intermittency problem. And yeah, Apoorv, I agree with you that the battery is definitely an issue, but unfortunately it's one that we've been waiting on, and we just haven't seen any improvements. So I think that you have methods within wind and solar power to address the intermittency problem to some degree. Of course, a true solution will need the batteries. But, wind, if you situate it correctly in the right areas, you actually get a power of 3, better wind capabilities, wind generation capabilities. Right now we're building them in sort of sporadic places. There are offshore opportunities for wind as well. There's something that talks about doing that up northeast, but unfortunately I think it fell through. But there are definitely areas in which you can get larger wind power generations, and even in periods of the day that may not be where they currently are capable of doing. As well as on the solar side, you have people tend to think about solar photovoltaics, which of course do have a major problem with intermittency, but you also have ideas like solar power towers, which are essentially these towers full of salt that gets heated, molten salt by the sun throughout the day, and then it can generate even after the sun is cleared and you're into nightfall because of the molten properties of the salt.
Okay, I'm going to give Andrew 30 seconds here, then we're going to jump to audience questions. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, as an engineer looking at wind energy, I'm actually not quite in favor of it in the long term, due to the fact that there's only so much you can do with a big fan on a big stick. So essentially, it comes down to things like solar and hydrogen and new technologies. And while capital is a problem, while capital will, vanish, or maybe we can transition it into new tech, new alternative energy R&D. The point is that in the end, research and development has to win out. The technology has to be cheaper, and that's how we solve the capital.
Can I say something for 30 seconds?
Yeah, real quick.
So I actually don't believe that wind and solar are ever going to become massive energy sources due to the area that they need to create energy. To supply like the energy of the U.S., it would take almost the entire continent, and it's a lot of land mass. And so if we went to the ocean or for wind, or if we went to space for solar, I think it could become viable, but right now I see it being used on kind of a smaller residential basis.
Okay, I've got a stack of questions here from the audience, so we've got thanks for those comments. A lot of stuff to chew on there. The audience is clearly well informed about energy issues, and they've got a lot of good questions. So let me make sure that I give them equal time. Let me start with kind of a broad one on natural gas, and I'll direct this to Josh. I'll start with Josh. It says almost all of you have natural gas in your plans in some form, and see it playing a bigger role. Will pushing for natural gas result in a natural gas dependency similar to our current oil and coal dependency? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that natural gas is a lot more abundant in certain areas of the United States, certainly. And now we are talking global, of course, but I think within the United States, we don't have so much oil, but we have a lot of coal and natural gas. And I think part of this is using the resources we already have. We're already one of the world's, if not the world's largest oil importer. Well, let's use our resources first.
Elise, do you want to weigh in with a thought there?
So I think if we have natural gas as part of our portfolio, but have a mixed portfolio and not be, I guess, as dependent on it as we are on oil currently, I think that won't be an issue. As we've all been discussing different methods to provide energy, natural gas is just one of a few.
Okay, let me, hand in hand, when you talk about natural gas, you almost have to talk about hydraulic fracturing and some of the issues that we're discussing here in the United States now. Raj, you mentioned this in your presentation. When do you know when to regulate fracking is a question we have from the audience.
Yeah, I think you have to, continue to do studies, and there have definitely been studies coming out on both sides, whether there are significant environmental costs or whether there are not. And at some point, once you have a body of work and once you have a body of studies, you need to just say, here are the costs that are associated with that. And at some point there will be costs that we're going to live with, and that's fine. But we as a society will decide these are the costs we're fine with, and if the costs are above that, we have to regulate it. Because we cannot just have zero regulation and then have significant health risks, and we can't have so many regulations that we don't have fracking. We have to find this sort of perfect balance, between some on the left are calling for significant regulations, and others on the right are saying zero regulation. So just finding the balance will be very critical, but also very difficult.
Andrew, how far off are we from finding that balance at this point? Are we a long way? Are we close?
I don't think it's too far off. I think if you put the right policies in place, then we can get there. But I think at the end of the day, beyond just natural gas, the ultimate goal is that natural gas is just a bridge to the future, to the alternative energies. So as far as fracking goes, Professor Barron here at Rice actually just gave a report to a commission, and he said that the chemicals used in fracking that people are so concerned about are the same chemicals that you eat in ice cream or that you purify water with. So essentially, my argument is that if we can get rid of oil, then we can also get rid of natural gas, and ultimately we can move towards these alternative energy fuels. Amy Jaffe here just actually, I believe, wrote an article on natural gas being the mecca of the Americas. But my argument here is that if we can shift from oil, then we can also shift away from natural gas.
And I'd just like to make a quick point. I think the one thing which we sometimes fail to notice is that every energy production method has its costs and its benefits. At the end of the day, when we use oil, there are costs. We pollute the world, we do whatever. When we refine oil, we have things coming out of it that are quite harmful, benzene, lead, whatever. The same could be true of wind. The same could be true of solar. The one main difference today is that we are far more informed. Today we look at each new alternate energy source as what are the costs, what are the benefits. When we started off using oil back in the 20s and 30s, we didn't care. All we saw was, this is an abundant energy source, let's grab it. Today we make these informed decisions. And I think it's good to have this debate. It's good to be able to question each side and say, look, is fracking good or is it bad? But eventually we need to also reach a decision after having conducted scientific, economic, several different types of analysis.
Let me ask sort of a broader question here that has to do with consumer behavior, but also is a very relevant question right now. You're seeing jobs pitted against conservation, or maybe that's not the best way to put it, but this question kind of touches on this issue. How do you propose we shift our political environment from favoring jobs to favoring energy efficiency? So clearly it's a slow economy, and efficiency is a nice word for cutting back. So how do you shift the thinking in Washington to favor conservation and efficiency versus just more and more jobs? Raj?
So let me just make perfectly clear. They are not mutually exclusive, right? let me give you a perfect example. This is what I worked on this summer. And you can retrofit 40% of the U.S. building stock and create 1 million jobs. They are not mutually exclusive. President Clinton just wrote a piece in Newsweek where he said if we retrofit 40% of the building stock, we get 1 million jobs. There's a very easy example is the Empire State Building, which was just retrofitted by Johnson Control Industries to save 38% of its energy use. So there's the energy efficiency, and created thousands of jobs. So they're not mutually exclusive. They both go hand in hand. You can stimulate the economy, save money on power bills, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and spur investment.
Yeah, Raj, I think that's spot on. I think it's important to remember that these are creating jobs. It's not a matter of we have to put conservation ahead of jobs or vice versa. I mean, a lot of these upcoming rising technologies are where the source of jobs are going to be coming from in the next century. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of these companies, these oil and gas and coal companies that are doing very well right now in the energy sector, are also actively diversifying their portfolios. And the reason is because they are having to look to the future. They're having to look towards a sustainable world. And that world involves investing in renewable and other energy sources. We can't just keep on doing the same thing we've used, whether it's the economics or the availability of the fuel sources or whatever. But we have to recognize that only by going to a diverse number of fuel sources can we actually both increase the number of jobs as well as provide for a sustainable future.
Let me move to another question because I've got a stack of them. I'm sure you all have intelligent responses on each one of these, but let me just for the sake of moving along. Here's one about Houston. I'm going to direct this one to Apoorv. Considering we're in Houston, how would you pitch the idea of aggressively increasing R&D in truly sustainable technologies to oil companies?
Actually, I'm so glad I got this question. We keep ignoring industry. And we sometimes tend to do this pitch against industry as the big bad wolf. Industry is not the big bad wolf. At the end of the day, industry found an opportunity and it made the most of it. As a chemical engineer, when you look at the best technologies today, you see that they came out of industry. Industry was the one that came up with fluidized bed, that came up with carbon strippers, that came up with sulfur dioxide strippers, everything. So yes, there have been subsidies provided by the government and so on. Regulation has, of course, been a very big and important step there. But industry is the one that will lead the future, will be the one that will push people and will give people the confidence that we are moving towards something that you want. Selling it to the oil companies here, I think we make a mistake because we end up saying we're selling it to the oil companies. Oil companies have already started doing this. They've rebranded themselves as energy companies. And it's so true. They can really be seen as an energy company. If you tell an oil company today, you've got the same technology that could extract gas, but instead of extracting oil, let's shift it to that gas, they'd be very happy to do so. They'd say, you know what? I need to tweak my compressor here and there, but I think I could do it. So effectively, we could convince the same people who today are looked at as the villain in this whole story, and we could make them into the superhero. Also, they're making huge profits. We can encourage them. As citizens, we can encourage them. As the government, we can encourage them. And industry-wide, they can encourage themselves and say, you know what? I'm making $20 billion of profit. Let me put this into R&D. Maybe I'll be able to make $20 billion every year this way.
Let me ask Elise, do you see a role for major oil companies to become superheroes, as Apoorv said?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said. And even Exxon now is starting up a pilot plant with algae. And like he said, I feel like government has, yes, they have some money, but the industries already have money. And I think they've come to a realization that oil is not going to be the only energy source. So they are actively researching. And I think we could encourage a more diverse research area, and maybe it would be nice to have different companies focusing on different things, just because we don't know what's going to be the next big solution. So I think the energy companies are going to be the ones who lead the way in our new technologies.
Andrew, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think my plan goes right along with this, because if you look at my carbon tax plan, what it actually does is while we're taxing carbon and it looks like we're hurting industry, the plan is actually we reinvest that funding with certain guidelines back into the same industry, so then they can invest in these new alternative energy developments. So what we have to do is make the clear argumentation that energy is really the new gold mine of America. It's everything that's going to push America forward. And the same companies that are controlling oil today want to control energy in the future. And that's why they're investing so many millions of dollars into alternative energy technologies.
So we're talking about industry's role in changing the energy paradigm. This is a question about government's role in incentivizing some of these new technologies that you're talking about. Given the recent political and economic catastrophe with Solyndra, the California-based solar panel company, what types of standards need to be in place to evaluate how effectively government capital is invested? Raj, you want to take that one?
Yeah. The DOE loan guarantee program is set up to backstop loans made by the bank, and it only costs taxpayers money if a company goes bankrupt. And yes, Solyndra went bankrupt, and yes, it appears that there might have been some sort of corrupt practices in terms of giving them the loan. Yes. But why is government here in the first place? It's because banks and private capital are too afraid to go in because the technologies are just too risky. So yes, some of these companies are going to fail. Yes, I mean, if they weren't failing, there would be no role for the government. I mean, private capital is there. There's plenty of private capital to invest in these companies, but because they're just too risky, that's why the government is there as a backstop, right? And the second thing I would say is look, I mean, we're all focusing on Solyndra as sort of this like one big thing that failed, and yes, it failed. But there have been 30, 40, 50, 60 other projects that have been successful, have created jobs, have led to new technologies, and have, created investment, which have cost the taxpayers $0 because those companies paid back their loans to the bank. So the government is required to sort of get past this, what's termed the valley of death, which is basically when you're going from something in the lab to the first commercialization phase when there's basically no private capital available just because of the risk.
Josh, you want to weigh in on that question?
Well, I just want to say that, I think that R&D investments are good, but I think investing in performance is even better. And so with wind, you have competitive renewable energy zones where essentially the states or the government encourages the actual building of the infrastructure. And so certainly this wouldn't be applicable to technologies like the biofuels, but I think that it's important that we also encourage performance, and we've seen really important improvements stemming from energy tax credits on solar and wind and the like, and so possible applications to other energy sources I think would be a very good thing.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think what you just cited is the exact reason why Solyndra failed, because the infrastructure wasn't ready, is because people are trying to commercialize technologies that are not ready yet. And that's why my plan puts such a great emphasis on R&D. So it's not the government's role to invest all these billions of dollars in infrastructure right now. It's the government's role right now to invest millions and billions of dollars into research and engineering technologies. We have to make the technologies work before forcing them into action.
Well, that's a good segue into the next question here. So hold the thought, Raj. So we're talking about technologies and maybe the role for government to invest in some of those things or breakthrough technologies. This question it talks about the intermittency problem that Amy brought up. You all talked about wind and solar power's intermittency problems. Do you think wave energy can overcome this? So here's maybe for one of the engineers. I see you nodding along. Apurav, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I actually wrote about this in my paper as well. Wave is an untapped resource. Its potential at the current efficiency levels of current wave generators is 3 terawatts. But of course, we're not going to cover the entire ocean with waves. That would be ridiculous. But the fact of the matter does exist that waves are a continuous form of energy. Intermittency is not as much of a problem. And there are several companies across the world, including Pelamis wind generators, for example, and others, and most of them are in Europe currently, who have been pushing this technology. Now, why is wave better than wind? Actually, part of what our research that we've done at Rice, and one of the very impressive jobs that a team from our department did, was looking at potentially using wind power as an intermittent source of energy to potentially extract gas from gas wells in the North Sea. So looking at wind power to power other options. One of the biggest problems with most renewables today is that the amount of hydrocarbons that are used to just get everything together to actually build a solar cell, it's quite ridiculous. They almost go over the amount of carbon. It's not carbon neutral, let's be honest. It's actually carbon positive. You're adding more carbon. And I think wave provides that option where, because of its lack of intermittency problems, its lack of battery technology necessity as well. You don't need batteries as much. And its ability to be placed pretty much anywhere in the world. it provides an excellent option. And I definitely see this being something that we should invest more in terms of research and development in over the next 30 to 50 years. It could be transformative.
Here's another idea. Should the U.S. spend more on fusion research? Does any of your plans address that? See a role for fusion in the future? Andrew's resident saying, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's the government's role to throw the biggest blanket possible at these R&D developments. The governments should not pick and choose which one's going to work, because honestly, we don't know which one's going to be the most efficient in the future. We don't know which one it's going to lend itself to. And so I bring up the harms of nuclear again, things like 10 years to build, too much capital, all of these different problems. But I think it can be feasible, especially the next generation nuclear. But I would put more emphasis on solar and hydrogen personally.
I'd actually like to personally disagree with this whole concept of the Manhattan Project and moving forward like the space race. Actually, Daniel Yergin, one of the most famous energy economists in the world, made this point very recently. It's on NPR if anyone would like to hear it. He made this point that energy is too complex an issue. You want to put a man on the moon. That is an objective that you can see. What is our objective today? Can anyone outline a clear policy for energy? People yell about energy independence. People yell about reducing greenhouse gases. But do we really have a clear outline of what we want to do? No, and that's why we're sitting here, obviously. But also, we want to establish what our objective is. And we don't have one objective for energy policy. So we can't go about doing a space race when we don't know where we want to get to. There is no moon here. We want to find out what our moon is first, and then get to there. And I think that's why I'd like to kindly disagree with Andrew, who I adore otherwise.
Elise, do you think that our approach should be a Manhattan Project style focus on the energy problem?
I think that I'm kind of the opinion that the world needs to realize this mission that we really do, energy is a problem, and I don't think it's something that one country can do by themselves. And so no, I don't think that Manhattan Project is the best way, because I think it's going to need to be a collaborative project, really. Every country is going to have something that they can contribute, and I think it's just through R&D that we can have international collaborations that we're really going to come to a true solution.
Andrew's the one that brought up the Manhattan Project idea, so we'll let him defend it.
Yeah, so look, I agree and disagree at the same time. So the idea of a Manhattan or an Apollo mission is not to have this intensive study or energy development of one thing, but it's to throw this blanket on all of the energy problem. It's just a Manhattan Project for energy in general. I'm not saying one thing. I'm not saying going to the moon. I'm not saying what is our moon. That's what we're trying to define today. But the idea was proposed by Nobel laureate Richard Smalley, and I would propose it again here and say that this is our Manhattan Project. We need this intensive energy development, not for one thing, but really for a blanket for all things to see what really works.
Well, one thing is clear: energy is a huge problem, a very complex problem that we'll probably spend all of our lifetimes trying to solve. And we've heard a lot of great ideas here. Let's give our panel of students a big round of applause. So at this time, I'd like to ask for you to pull out your ballots and consider the names there and vote on who you believe fared the best up here today. And then we're going to come around and collect those, and let's take a minute to do that. We're going to have some folks come around and collect those cards. And let's see, go ahead and okay. Yeah. So go ahead, and if you would take a second to fill those out. Someone will come around to collect your card. And we're going to let the students get out of the bright lights of the spotlight here for a few minutes and catch their breath. And the judges and we were going to convene in the back, and we're going to come back and announce the winner. Thanks very much.
By popular vote, the top three are Andrew, Apurv, and Raj. And both by popular vote and by the verdict of our jury, the winner tonight is Apurv. Everybody here. Okay.
Unaccustomed as you are.
Very good, that's it for tonight. I want to thank everybody again for participating, thank the judges, and one more round of applause for our fantastic candidates.